The Red Death had long devastated the country. No disease had ever been so fatal or so hideous. Blood was its avatar and its seal, the redness and the horror of blood. There were sharp pains and sudden dizziness, and then profuse bleeding at the pores, and then death. The scarlet stains upon the body, and especially upon the face of the victim, were signs that shut him out from the aid and from the sympathy of his fellow men. And the whole attack, progress, and termination of the disease was completed in half of an hour. But the Prince Prospero was happy and fearless and clever. When his lands were half depopulated, he summoned to his presence 1,000 healthy and light-hearted friends from among the knights and the dames of his court, and with these he retired to deep seclusion in one of his castled abbeys. This was a magnificent structure. A strong and lofty wall circled it in. This wall had gates of iron. When all had entered, the gates were shut. They resolved to leave no possibility of entrance or exit, regardless of the sudden impulses or of despair or of frenzy from within. The abbey was well supplied. With such precautions, the nobles could defy the disease. The external world could take care of itself. In the meantime, it was a waste of time to grieve or to think. The prince had provided all the appliances of pleasure. There were comedians, there were actors, there were ballet dancers, there were musicians, there was beauty, there was wine. All these and security within. Outside was the Red Death. It was toward the close of the 5th month of their seclusion, and while the pestilence raged most furiously abroad, that Prince Prospero entertained his 1,000 friends at a masked ball of the most unusual magnificence. It was a voluptuous scene, that masquerade. But first, let me tell you of the rooms in which it was held. There were 7. It was an imperial suite. In many palaces, these rooms form a long and straight view. Folding doors slide back nearly to the walls on either side so that there is a view of the whole palace. Here, the case was very different, as might be expected from the Duke's love of the bizarre. There was a sharp turn every 20 or 30 yards, and each turn a novel effect. To the right and left, and in the middle of each wall, a tall and narrow Gothic window. These windows were of stained glass, whose color changed depending on the color of the room. The easternmost room, for example, was hung in blue, and vividly blue were its windows. The second chamber was purple in its ornaments and tapestries, and here the panes were purple. The third was green throughout. The fourth was finished and lighted with orange, and the fifth with white. The sixth with violet. The 7th apartment was closely shrouded in black velvet tapestries that hung all over the ceiling and down the walls, falling in heavy folds upon the black carpet. But in this chamber only, the color of the windows failed to match the decorations. The panes here were scarlet red, a deep blood color. In the black chamber, the effect of the firelight that streamed upon the dark hangings through the blood-tinted panes was ghastly and extreme, and produced so wild a look upon the faces of those who entered that there were few of the company who were bold enough to set their foot within this dark room. In the back of the black room stood a gigantic clock of black ebony. Its pendulum swung to and fro with a dull and heavy, monotonous clang, and when the minute hand made the circuit of the face and the hour was stricken, there came from the brazen lungs of the clock a sound which was near and clear and loud and deep and exceedingly musical, but of so peculiar a note and emphasis that at each hour the musicians of the orchestra were forced to pause momentarily in their performance to listen to the sound. And thus the dancers ceased their revolutions, and there was a brief, uncomfortable moment in the happy company, and while the chimes of the clock yet rang, it was seen that even the loudest and the liveliest partier grew pale, and the older, quieter guests passed their hands over their brows as if they were deep in thought. But when the echoes of the clock had fully ceased, light laughter at once filled the assembly. The musicians looked at each other and smiled at their own nervousness. Yet, after the lapse of 60 minutes, there came yet another chiming of the clock, and then were the same disconcert and trembling meditation as before. But in spite of these things, it was a joyful and a magnificent party. The tastes of the Duke were peculiar. He had a fine eye for colors and effects. His plans were bold and fiery. There were some who would have thought him mad. His followers felt he was not. It was necessary to hear and see and touch him to be sure that he was not. There was much glare and glitter and phantasm. There were delirious fancies such as a madman makes. There was much beautiful, much wanton, much of the bizarre, something of the terrible, and not a little of that which might have caused disgust. To and fro in the 7 chambers there stalked, in fact, a multitude of dreams. And these dreams, the dreams, writhed in and about, taking color from the rooms and causing the wild music of the orchestra to echo their steps. And then, again, there strikes the ebony clock, which stands in the back of the black velvet room. And then, for a moment, all is still, and all is silent, save the voice of that clock. The dreams are stiff, frozen as they stand. But the echoes of the chime die away, and again the music swells, and the dreams live, and they writhe to and fro merrily, taking hue from the many-colored windows through which stream rays of light. But to the black chamber none of the masked guests go, for the blackness of the sable drapery appalls. And to them whose foot falls upon the thick black carpet, there comes from the near clock of ebony a solemn chime more forceful than any which reaches the ears of the guests in the other rooms. But these rooms were densely crowded, and in them beat feverishly the heart of life, and the party whirled on until the sounding of the midnight upon the clock, and then the music stopped, and the spins of the dancers stopped, and there was an uneasy feeling. And before the last echoes of the last chime had utterly sunk into silence, there were many individuals in the crowd who became aware of the presence of a masked figure who had caught the attention of no one before. And the rumor of this new presence spread itself whisperingly around. There arose at length from the whole company a buzz or a murmur, disapproval and surprise, and then finally of terror, of horror, and of disgust. Even in the middle of a party such as this, with bizarre costumes and characters in attendance, this masked stranger was different. The figure was tall and thin, covered from head to foot in the clothing of the grave. The mask that concealed the face was made to resemble a stiffened corpse. And yet, all this might have been overlooked during a wild party. But the actor had gone so far as to assume the look of the Red Death. His clothes were dabbled in blood, and his broad forehead, with all the features of the face, was sprinkled with the scarlet horror. When the eyes of the Prince Prospero looked upon this ghastly image, which with a slow and solemn movement walked back and forth among the dancers, he was convulsed in the first moment with a strong shudder, either of terror or distaste. But in the next, his face reddened with rage. "Who dares," he demanded hoarsely of the courtiers who stood near him, "who dares insult us with this blasphemous mockery? Seize him, unmask him, that we may know whom we have to hang at sunrise from the castle wall." It was in the eastern or blue chamber in which stood the prince as he uttered these words. They rang throughout the 7 rooms loudly and clearly, for the prince was bold and a robust man, and the music had become hushed at the waving of his hand. But from a certain nameless awe with which the stranger had inspired in the whole party, there was no one who lifted a hand to seize him, and so he continued to walk until he passed within a yard of the prince, and the vast assembly, as if with one impulse, shrank from the centers of the room to the walls. He made his way uninterruptedly, but with the same solemn step, the same solid step that had alerted the people to his presence. Through the blue chamber to the purple, through the purple to the green, through the green to the orange, through this again to the white, and even thence to the violet, no one moved to stop him. Prince Prospero, mad with rage and the shame of his own cowardice, rushed through the 6 chambers, holding his dagger above his head. He entered the final black velvet room, where the masked figure suddenly turned to face him. There was a sharp cry, and the dagger dropped gleaming on the black carpet. In the next second, Prince Prospero fell face first into the sable carpet, stone dead. On seeing what had happened to their host, a crowd of partiers summoned the wild courage of despair and charged into the black apartment, violently attacking the masked stranger. The tall figure stood straight and motionless within the shadow of the ebony black clock as the crowd rushed in on him. Suddenly, a gasp of horror went up from the surging mob. Only limp grave clothes and an empty mask met this violent attack. And now was recognized the presence of the Red Death. He had come like a thief in the night, and one by one each dropped in the blood-sprinkled halls of the castle. Each died in the despairing posture of his fall, and the life of the ebony clock went out with the life of the last guest, and the flames of the lamps winked out one by one, and darkness covered them, and decay enveloped them, and the Red Death held illimitable dominion over all.